Well, guys, once again, it's looking like something we have long suspected may turn out to be true, that the prevailing narrative around the history of Generation 2 of crypto is not exactly what we've been told. If you never bought into all the ridiculous groupthink in the first place because it just didn't add up, or if you're finding value in these videos, please consider delegating to the Army of Spies stake pool, ticker AOS. The history of crypto is often summed up in the form of generations. We have Gen 1. This, of course, was Satoshi's invention of Bitcoin and a solution to the Byzantine general's dilemma. All of those great things that form the basis of all of cryptocurrency and blockchains in general. Then we come to Gen 2. Gen 2 introduced smart contracts. And of course, this was Ethereum. Here's where the history starts getting a little bit weird because Ethereum was formed by a number of different people. Among those people were Charles Hoskinson. Charles Hoskinson. Charles Hoskinson was one of the founders of Ethereum. He was also the CEO of Ethereum for a short amount of time. And this isn't something he tends to want to talk about. Every time I hear Charles mention this, it's sort of him begging the media, the crypto media, and the general media no longer to label him as a founder of Ethereum, no longer to mention that for a short amount of time he was the CEO of Ethereum. He doesn't even really want to talk about it. He wants to talk about Cardano, the Cardano ecosystem, and the things Cardano has going forward. And this makes sense because it's been almost a decade. It's been almost a decade since Charles was involved with Ethereum, and he was only there for a short amount of time. However, because Cardano has grown to be such a big ecosystem, and because it's on the cutting edge of crypto innovation, crypto technology, and let's face it, from the perspective of all of us in the Cardano ecosystem, Cardano is doing a lot of things a lot better than Ethereum. This is problematic because the Ethereum ecosystem is the second biggest ecosystem in all of crypto. It's gigantic. It's not a little bit bigger than Cardano. It's a lot bigger than Cardano. And if you're someone who is invested either emotionally, intellectually, philosophically, or economically in the continued dominance of the Ethereum ecosystem, it's problematic if there is this smaller ecosystem, although in the top 10, but a smaller ecosystem that seems to have maybe better tech. Maybe it has better tech than Ethereum. This is very threatening. So, along with the rise of Cardano, which has been now, what are we? Were we 6 years in, almost 7 years into the existence of Cardano? What we've seen is a growing cacophony of of criticism of Cardano, this unified narrative, and a big important piece of this narrative, because they can't erase the fact that Charles was one of the founders of Ethereum. They can't really erase that piece. So instead, what they do is they criticize his activities as a part of Ethereum, which is kind of hilarious because Charles doesn't even want to talk about his time at Ethereum because it's no longer relevant. He was there for a short amount of time, which he's constantly trying to point out to everybody, and he doesn't really care about it anymore. When Charles left Ethereum, he gave all of his ether. It seems like most of the, all the founders, of course, as they would, had access to a certain amount of ether. They could have taken their ether with them. Charles gave all of his ether to his executive assistant. He gave all of it to his executive assistant. And as you can imagine, this is an amount of ether that would shortly thereafter be worth a huge amount of money. He gave it all to his executive assistant. That's how much he didn't want anything to do with Ethereum. And since then, all we hear is Charles talking about how he doesn't want to talk about Ethereum. Please stop labeling him as the founder of Ethereum, as one of the founders of Ethereum, as the ex-CEO of Ethereum. He wants to talk about Cardano. But this narrative, this unified narrative arose not necessarily to, not directly to criticize the purpose. I'll put it this way. The purpose was not to address anything that actually happened during Charles's short tenure with Ethereum. It was to discredit Cardano because Cardano was this rising ecosystem that, according to us, has better technology than Ethereum. This is problematic for Ethereum. So instead of attacking Cardano on the technical merits, which isn't really possible because Cardano has rock solid technology. You can't really discredit Cardano on the basis of its community because we have one of pound for pound, one of the strongest communities in the history of crypto. So you get a problem if you're an Ethereum. If you're an Ethereum ecosystem member trying to discredit Cardano, you can't attack the technology. You can't attack the community. You have to resort to ad hominems. And the face of Cardano is Charles Hoskinson. And you can't really attack Charles for much that's gone on in Cardano. Sure, I mean, you can criticize, many different moves. You could decide that IOG made a wrong move here, a wrong move there. They could have done this better, they could have done that better. That's just the nature of being a company in any sector. Any sector. You're going to have critics who are going to criticize and you know, claim they would have made different decisions. But of course, hindsight is 2020, all those kind of things. So that's all pretty minor. So it's even difficult to criticize what IOG has done in the ecosystem so far, at least to any crazy level. But they can resort back to making the ad hominem, not about what Charles has done in Cardano or what IOG has done in Cardano. If they're gonna use the ad hominem attack, they have to go back to Charles's time in Ethereum. So the only playbook they really had was reach back basically a decade, reach back into the past a decade and repeat the unified narrative about that time, which is roughly Charles equals bad. No need to investigate this Cardano ecosystem. No need to look at what they're doing over there. We can dismiss the entire notion of Cardano by telling you Charles equals bad. Look, everyone in Ethereum knows the narrative is Charles equals bad. Do you want to be outside of the flock? Do you want to be outside of the group? Are you going to reject the groupthink on this and be some kind of Cardano interested person outside of the group who rejects what everyone knows? Charles equals bad. No need to look at Cardano because Charles equals bad. And this probably peaked with Laura Shin's book, The Cryptopians, which has been discussed quite a bit in the Cardano ecosystem. I think we can all say that people have a lot of things. People in Cardano have a lot of things to say about that book, and not very many of them seem to be positive because the book is kind of the culmination of that entire narrative. No reason to even think about Cardano because Charles equals bad. But you have to think about what we're talking about here because Charles was a homeschooled, Bitcoin rich 27-year-old CEO or thereabouts in his late 20s. Think about that. He's homeschooled. He goes to college at a very young age, apparently. He is brilliant in, areas of study that are well suited for crypto. He becomes Bitcoin rich. He then becomes the CEO of the most important, most interesting technology in all of tech, Gen 2 of crypto. Can you even imagine how much you would have pissed people off if you were this 27-year-old? I think probably the entire world would have hated me based on the things I would have been saying if I was a Bitcoin rich, homeschooled 27-year-old CEO of Ethereum. So, if we list this man's crimes against humanity, they basically boil down to he was a 27-year-old CEO and he said things that made people mad. I personally am shocked and blindsided by this news. So that's the history we've been working with for the last couple of years. Fast forward to November 2023, and as covered previously on this channel, we started seeing posts from the account of Steven Narioff. Posts like this: Ethereum is the fraudulent elephant in the room. In plain sight, 1000x bigger than SBF. Joe Lubin and Vitalik Buterin have been the front with corrupt officials at the highest levels of federal agencies, such as Clayton Gensler and many others. Of course, these are explosive claims, and we're used to seeing crazy stuff in crypto. The big question was, would anything actually come of this? Amazingly, he actually delivered in the form of this free NFT on Matic. And it's about 2 hours and 44 minutes of phone conversations between him, Steven Narioff, and Vitalik Buterin in 2014. It sounds like right after Charles had left Ethereum. And Ethereum does not sound like it was in a good place. It sounds like Ethereum is in chaos and nobody's sure what's going to happen, whether they'll run out of money, whether people might have to go to jail. All of these kinds of things seem to be up in the air. It sounds like Ethereum is not in a good place at all. It did not look like a bright, cheery, and rosy future for Ethereum. Things were looking pretty rough. So Narioff also delivered a transcript of this very long 2 hour and 44-minute conversation. It's a series of conversations, sounds like a series of calls, probably over some period of time, between he and Vitalik, where it sounds like Steven Narioff is in some kind of advisor role to Vitalik. How do we fix this situation? How do we rescue everything? And if you think I was exaggerating when I said people going to prison was a question that was up in the air, when I control F prison in this document, this transcript of their conversations, it comes up 7 times. Maybe one of the most interesting is this second mention. Steven Narioff is talking to Vitalik, and Vitalik asks him, "Hey, do you want to talk to Gav?" We can assume this is Gavin Wood, separately another one of the founders who went on to be a part of Polkadot. He says, "Do you want to talk to Gavin separately?" Narioff says, "Yeah, I'm happy to. Again, my goal is to keep everybody out of prison. But like I said, as long as they keep you out of prison, but by doing that, it'll be keeping everybody out of prison. Because if you're not going to prison, nobody's going to prison. You're the front line. And so if we can protect you, everybody else is getting protected also. And unless they did something just totally that you're not aware of, that was just crazy. And I don't put it past anybody to have done that. So that I think is really important. But I do think that it's also, I mean, from a marketing perspective, and then he goes on and on and on. But there's a little bit of talk. There's actually talk about people going to prison. And you got to remember, this conversation is happening back in 2014. The whole concept of an ICO had just come about. And people weren't exactly sure how this was going to interact with the securities laws. And this is something that has been discussed very heavily in the XRP litigation with the SEC, all of these kind of things. I think people in crypto are kind of familiar with the trajectory of that whole conversation. But at this time, it's 2014. Ethereum did a big ICO for Ether, and nobody was really clear how legal and regulatory authorities were going to react to that. So there was a lot up in the air. Things were very much uncertain at this point in the history of crypto, exactly where things were going to go. So, what does all this have to do with Charles and Cardano? Well, it's in this transcript that we see the situation on the ground in 2014 when Charles had left Ethereum seems wildly different than what that prevailing narrative about Charles and his time at Ethereum has been telling us all these years. So, starting out with this, Steven Narioff is trying to convince Vitalik. It sounds like he's trying to talk to Vitalik about the possibility of having NDAs in Ethereum, having people sign NDAs. And he says, "You guys, in a way, were lucky with Charles and Amir. I think Amir is interested in his ether going up, and I don't know that it's in his personality to badmouth. And Charles, obviously, it's not in his personality to have a bad mouth because he has nothing to lose by bad mouthing at this point. It actually says a lot about his character because he gave all of his ether to Jeremy. and he hasn't said anything negative about the company. And from my understanding, there were no NDAs in the entire company. So they're having this discussion, and Narioff is telling Vitalik, apparently he'd been to some kind of a New York meetup that Charles was at, and he's telling Vitalik that Ethereum has actually been really lucky because the two people who had left, including Charles, hadn't said a single bad thing about Ethereum. And in Charles' case, it was kind of puzzling because Charles had nothing to lose by saying something bad about Ethereum. He had given all of his Ether to Jeremy, so he didn't have to worry about the price of Ether going up. And he hadn't signed any NDAs with Ethereum, apparently. So you can tell that Narioff has a pretty glowing appraisal of Charles, just sort of generally so far. What he doesn't have such a glowing opinion of is what's happening at this time at Ethereum. So we come to this section of the conversation where they're discussing how much money Ethereum has. Vitalik says, of Bitcoin and fiat together, I think we have about somewhere from 11 to 12,000 BTC, which is in the 2.7 to $3 million range. And then we have somewhere between 1.5 and 2 million in fiat on top of that. Narioff says, and again, this transcript and the audio are all presented by Narioff. I'm not presenting any of this as truth. We're just talking about what someone else has posted here. He says, according to this transcript, okay, all right. I mean, I can send this to you after, but let me just kind of go in some. First of all, I want to kind of go over some things that are personally very disturbing to me that I want to bring to your attention. He says the fact that the position wasn't hedged, and he's talking about that BTC position. What he's worried about here is that the value of Bitcoin could go down, which it did eventually. The value of Bitcoin would go down, and they'd be left with no money to do the development that was required to bring Ethereum 1.0 and Ethereum 2.0 to market. He says, absolutely inexcusable. I don't care, by the way. I don't care if BTC went to 2000. The point of this wasn't to ride BTC. It was to make sure you had enough money to see this thing through 1.0 and then do development on 2.0 as well, while you maintain 1.0 and then also be able to develop some of your own dApps, be able to encourage other people to do their dApps. And you don't want to launch this. It's like Xbox launching without any games. From my take on the marketplace, also is the lead that was once had out there isn't that same lead. And there's a lot of questions out there. Now, don't get me wrong. If I thought this was a completely lost cause, I wouldn't bother going into this. I'd just say there's nothing that you can do. But I'm not going to sugarcoat this. I'm telling you, I think you guys are I think it's crisis time. And I'll go over the reasons why. I think it's hard for me to imagine that there haven't been a lot of wires tripped on the legal side. You should be particularly concerned because of two reasons. Number one, and I told you point blank, I had heard from the inside that they wanted to send all of those letters out to the Ethereum guys. But because of the opinion, they weren't able to. Specifically, they wanted to hit you, and it's nothing personal, but you're the face of the company, and Charles isn't around anymore. So that would be issue one. And issue two is that there were decisions that you were made that you were put in a position to make. It's still baffling that people had the wherewithal to put you in that position, but nevertheless, they did, and you made the decision. And so for those decisions, they look to see who made the decisions, where things went. So you can see it's still very much up in the air. Narioff is saying, it's hard for me to imagine that there haven't been a lot of wires tripped on the legal side. And he's also saying, I had heard from the inside that they wanted to send all those letters out to the Ethereum guys. Specifically, they wanted to hit you. So it was very unclear at this point what the legal regulatory response to this whole ICO thing was that Ethereum had basically pioneered. So back to the Charles thing. So Narioff spends a lot of these conversations giving Vitalik advice about how to restructure Ethereum, just restructure the entire thing, the entire organization. And Narioff seems to be counseling that he seems to come from seems like a strong for profit corporate kind of background, building businesses and selling them, and he's obviously a lot more seasoned at this than Vitalik. A lot of people have characterized this as seeming like a man speaking to a child, a man giving advice to a child, which in fact was basically the case. What was Vitalik at this time, like 19 years old? And Narioff apparently had already built businesses and been involved in business for a long time, seemed to have a lot of good information. But among his advice was that they should hire a good CEO. And then they come to the topic of Charles, and he starts questioning whether or not Charles should have ever been fired. Naryov says, "So, I mean, one thing to be considered is to revisit that in your mind. Was that the right move regarding Charles?" Vitalik says, "Right. So, if it wasn't, is there a possibility of bringing him back? Or is that just that I could have a discussion at this point?" So, right away, we're deviating from the narrative. The narrative all along has been that everybody hated Charles. Charles was difficult. Charles said things that pissed people off, that whole narrative. But here we see Naryov involved in these long conversations with Vitalik. So obviously Vitalik was interested, because you don't have almost 3 hours of conversations with somebody unless you're interested in what they're saying. Vitalik seems very interested in Naryov's counsel in this case. Naryov says, "Hey, maybe you should relook at whether or not Charles should have been fired." And Vitalik says, "Right. So if it wasn't the right choice," and I'm reading into what's in the transcript here, but Vitalik basically says, "So if it wasn't the right choice, is there a possibility of bringing him back?" So here we see something very different than the narrative. Vitalik's wondering, is it possible to bring Charles back? This is completely different than the narrative we've been told by the Ethereum enthusiasts who have wanted to discredit Cardano. In fact, it looks like Vitalik, at least at this point in this conversation, was questioning, maybe it was a mistake. If it wasn't the right thing, is it possible to bring Charles back? This is a very different picture than what we've been told. Here we find out that the idea of bringing Charles back wasn't just some passing idea that they considered for a moment. They have a really long and detailed conversation about the possibility of bringing Charles back. Naryov says, "I look at what Charles' strengths and weaknesses were. Was it really the right move? Wasn't it the right move? I personally don't think it was the right move." He's saying he doesn't think it was a good idea to get rid of Charles. "I think it was the wrong move." Vitalik Buterin says, "I'm skeptical as well. I basically did it because everyone else was pretty much there, completely unwilling to work with him at all, and it was clear that the project wouldn't continue if he stuck around." Naryov says, "Yeah, basically the problem was that wasn't the case. You actually see you had the full hand. You had the full house rather. You had the money. Okay, you owned the brand. You were the brand. You were having $20 million coming your way. Nothing was going to stop. If every single person left but you and Charles, okay, it actually would have been a better thing, in my opinion. You wouldn't have been able to build this thing right back up." Vitalik doesn't like jump out of his chair and say that's not true. He says, "Right." And you can't tell, to Vitalik's credit here, you can't tell if he's really agreeing, if he's disagreeing, if he's just being polite and agreeable, or if he actually, when he says right, he's actually saying, okay, that might be correct. Naryov goes on, though. "You had all the cards. What were those people bringing to you? Nothing. I mean, I'm not saying nothing in terms of like, I'm not going to knock some of the technical people, but everybody's replaceable. You're hard to replace, first of all, because of your mind, because you're the founder, because you're the face of the company. It was your idea. You have the deepest understanding of it. But all that being said, let me tell you about myself." And then he talks about himself for a while and his experience with building companies. And then he goes back to Charles. "My thing on Charles is you need a Charles eventually. You need an interim guy. Could you bring back Charles? I think you could. That's my gut telling you." Vitalik again doesn't object. He says, "Right. I think he wouldn't even need to be able to. And I'll tell you," and he talks about Charles and some of Charles's strengths and weaknesses in his opinion. But he goes on, "I can tell you his reputation has gotten amazingly good. I don't know anyone more connected in this space. I don't know anybody who's got a better strategic vision in this space. I'm a big fan of his, and that is with his deficits. Me with him together, I could round him out. I could work with him to round him out." Again, remember, we're talking about like a 27-year-old Charles. "But it would take some really tough decision making on your behalf and faith on your behalf to do that outside of him. And he would need to be able to feel comfortable that he's got autonomy to do what he needs to do, that he's got a board that he has to respond to, but that he doesn't have 10 people looking over his shoulder over minor decisions, and that they do report to him." And Vitalik says, "Right. He needs to be able to have input into that. And you have to not worry about the CEO being more important because he's going to bring you those other people. You wouldn't have had any problem getting your entire development team and everything if Charles had stayed. He knows everybody in this space, and he's still somehow, now there are people that don't like him. I've talked to people that don't like him, but most people kind of do like him. They respect him. They respect his intellect and his capabilities. Even the ones that don't like him respect him, his capabilities anyway. And so that's saying something. And it's a very immature field. So there aren't a lot of people out here that Charles, has a certain bird's eye view of things that I haven't really seen out there. And I've talked to a lot of people out there, and none of them have his view of things and strategy. It's something that's he's worked really hard at learning how to do it, and it's innate to him. So that's something I think you should really be thinking about. Again, Vitalik doesn't say no out of the question. No, we're not bringing back Charles. He says, right. And Steven Narioff goes on, and he's definitely giving the hard press, the hard sells press. He is really trying to convince Vitalik to bring Charles back. He says it would take some hard decision making. Uh, I would make every effort to do it. If it was me, I'd call him up and I'd say, Charles, I'm sorry for what happened. I feel bad about it. Here's why it happened. I'd apologize to him because you're saying you feel bad about it, not groveling in that sense, but just clearing it up. And I talked to him. He's been very candid and honest about his strengths and weaknesses. And I said, well, that's a little different than the Charles I knew before. He was candid about it, but he was still, I think getting knocked that way twice in a row, that also does something. And I think that could go to your benefit. So I think you have a short window possibility of doing something with him. It sounds like he needs to get something going, but that's a possibility. And I would say sleep on it. Vitalik says, right. So Vitalik's not saying like, hey, this is out of the question. Hey, I don't think we should bring back Charles. He's saying he's skeptical about the decision to get rid of Charles. And when it's proposed, maybe bring Charles back, Vitalik just says, right. And then they come back and visit it again. They come back and talk about Charles again, and apparently Vitalik has talked to Gavin Wood in the meantime, and Vitalik reports this back. This is, I'm presuming, a different day or later in the same day, but a different phone conversation. He says, as far as Charles, I mean, and I believe he's talking about Gavin Wood here, he personally sees the weaknesses in Charles and he sees the strengths, and he might be willing to have Charles back on board in some fashion, not necessarily the top of everything, but at least as some kind of advisor. And aside from that, right now he's trying to balance dealing with, he really wants things on the foundation side to support it properly, as it's really distracting production and getting Ethereum done. So even Gavin Wood, Vitalik, after this conversation, went back, talked to Gavin Wood, and even Gavin Wood, it sounds like Gavin wasn't in favor of bringing Charles back in charge of everything. Basically, sounds like Gavin didn't want Charles in charge of him, but he was in favor of bringing Charles back. So we know there was some missing information. The narrative around Ethereum and Charles's involvement in Ethereum wasn't the whole story. So it leaves us asking, what else don't we know? What else was not an accurate depiction of what happened in the early days of Gen 2 of crypto? And Steven Narioff claims there's more. So you'll remember when we started talking about this, Steven Narioff claimed there was fraud. He used the word fraud, and that recording didn't seem to indicate fraud. What we see is Vitalik being pretty reasonable, to his credit. Again, Vitalik seems pretty reasonable in that conversation. He's listening to an advisor, considering what this advisor has to say, and then going and talking to other people about it, like Gavin Wood. Here's what Steven Narioff says about the fraud issue. He says, the recording isn't directly related to the fraud, but will illuminate a lot of what was really happening and show my involvement. The fraud will be in the lawsuit. So Steven Narioff has been saying this for a while, that there will be some kind of a lawsuit, and it sounds like he's indicating the lawsuit will allege fraud. So there's going to be more to this story. And I would say that Steven Narioff actually delivered on the audio recording of the conversations. There was no smoking gun in those conversations. I didn't see anything that, you know, was too damaging to anybody really, but it was very different than the narrative we've been told about crypto. So it leaves me wondering what's going to be in this lawsuit. Maybe he actually does have something that's going to be that's going to wildly change the history of what happened during this era, this establishment of Gen 2 in crypto. We'll have to wait and see what that is. I hope you had a great weekend. I think people in the US are getting ready for Thanksgiving this week. So I hope you're looking forward to a nice long, I think for most people, it's like a 4-day weekend. So I hope you're getting ready for a nice 4-day weekend, and I will talk to you soon.